Hey there, my name's Curtis Lucas and you're watching Empire Building. I don't typically get into and cover news events on this channel, but I came across something the other day that, in my opinion, was some of the biggest news to come out in cryptocurrency in a long time. And for some reason, everyone seems to have overlooked its significance. Federal Reserve endorses Ethereum-backed alternative to LIBOR. Okay, so if you're like me, when I first heard this, then you're probably thinking, what the hell is a LIBOR? I've mentioned it before that when it comes to investing, I'm still a relatively young investor. But I do a lot of research, and I'm pretty good at it, probably due to my background in engineering and physics.
Penny. I'm a physicist. I have a working knowledge of the entire universe and everything it contains.
Now, I may not have a working knowledge of the entire universe and everything that it contains, but when I started digging into this story, what I found shocked me. And it was also very clear to me that this was very exciting for the future of Ethereum. Many of you may already be fully aware of what LIBOR is and its significance. But for those of you who are like me, then you're in for a treat, because this story gets pretty juicy. We've got conspiracy, fraud, government cover-ups, and 5 people who were sentenced to prison, the maximum sentence of which was 14 years. So take my hand and let's go down that rabbit hole together. But first, make sure you smash that like button for the YouTube algorithm, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel. So first things first, we got to get the boring part out of the way. What is LIBOR? LIBOR stands for London Interbank Offered Rate. Put quite simply, this is meant to be an average interest rate that banks would charge one another for money borrowed overnight from one another. This rate is determined by a select number of banks submitting an estimate of what they believe they would be charged every day for borrowing that money. The rate simply takes an average of those banks' submittals, and that becomes the LIBOR rate. The next thing you need to understand is that the LIBOR rate is a very big deal. It underpins a $350 trillion worldwide derivatives market. To put that into perspective, the worldwide GDP is approximately $81 trillion. If you have a mortgage, or a student loan, or a car loan, or even a credit card, then you're directly impacted by this rate. The rate that banks charge each other overnight acts as a benchmark for all other credit markets. Okay, so now that you know what LIBOR is, let's get to the juicy part. Back in 2012, reports began to surface about a new scandal within the banks, suggesting that many of the banks were colluding with one another to fix the LIBOR rate by falsely stating the rate that they would realistically be paying at any given time. So understandably, there was a lot of outrage from the politicians and the public in general, since there was already a healthy amount of distrust of the banks following the 2008 financial crisis.
Good evening. How do we put some of the banker blame game behind us? Bob Diamond, the head of Barclays, asked the Select Committee last year. Tonight, he may be eating his words after his bank was found guilty of lying over the course of 4 years about the interest rate it was having to pay to borrow money, as a result of instructions from Barclays' senior management. Well, today, Mr. Diamond apologised and agreed to lose his bonus as calls came for him to lose his job. Tonight, Newsnight has learned the names of other banks under the spotlight for doing exactly the same thing.
Imagine that. When you leave very powerful banks to self-regulate, they have a tendency to misbehave and violate the public trust. Also, it's been suggested that the Bank of England may have been caught up in this itself. The BBC obtained secret recordings of a couple of traders that were discussing the pressure being put on them by the Central Bank of England to lower the LIBOR rate beyond realistic levels.
The bottom line is you're going to absolutely hate this. We've had some very serious pressure from the UK government and the Bank of England about pushing our LIBORs lower. Okay.
So I'll push them below a realistic level where I think I can get money.
Absolutely. The fact of the matter is that we've got the Bank of England, all sorts of people involved in the whole thing. I am as reluctant as you are. These guys have just turned around and said, just do it.
Unbelievable.
So now, as you might expect, the senior bank officials and the Bank of England denied these allegations and claimed that they had no knowledge of the lowballing until 2012, since at the time, LIBOR was unregulated. So is this upsetting to you yet? Just wait, it gets better. The UK's Serious Fraud Office opened an investigation on July 6, 2012, after Barclays was fined £290 million or $450 million after admitting that it had made inappropriate submissions of the LIBOR rate. The investigation was carried out until October of 2019, and in that time, only 17 traders were charged, and all but 4 were acquitted, except for one who pled guilty. The harshest sentence fell on Tom Hayes, a Citigroup trader who was found guilty and sentenced to 14 years in prison.
On Monday in London, ex-trader Tom Hayes was sentenced to 14 years in jail after being found guilty of conspiring to rig LIBOR benchmark interest rates.
Amir, this is actually a really big victory for the UK's Serious Fraud Office, or SFO, which brought the case against Tom Hayes, and whose director has described LIBOR prosecution as the agency's top priority. But Justice Jeremy Cook, who presided over the case, said a message had to be sent to the world about dishonest conduct in financial services, saying, quote, "Probity and honesty are essential, as is trust. The LIBOR activities of which Hayes took part in puts all of that in jeopardy." So strong words from the presiding judge in that case.
Indeed, they are. Can you give us a little bit more background on who this Tom Hayes is? Because he seems like a very central figure to this entire scandal here.
Absolutely. Now, Mr. Hayes, he's a 35-year-old British man who is also a mildly autistic mathematician and has been diagnosed with a mild form of Asperger's syndrome. And, you know, this has created kind of a quirky personality that he had, and it even garnered him the nickname Rain Man among his bank colleagues. Now, he said during his trial that he had been transparent about trying to influence rates and that his managers were well aware of and condoned the trading methods which he employed, which were actually common industry practices. And Hayes said that at the time, LIBOR just simply was unregulated, and he believed that his requests for rate levels, it fell within this permissible range. And he even left a trail of emails and computer chats because he just didn't think that he was doing anything wrong.
It's not that I feel sorry for these guys. As far as I'm concerned, they got exactly what they deserved. But you'd have to be naive to believe that these 5 guys were the crux of this entire system, with no knowledge from their superiors. By now you've got to be asking yourself, what about the Bank of England? What about the senior bank officials? Both the chairman and the CEO of Barclays resigned. They were questioned, but both claimed that they had no knowledge of these events until the news was made public. No charges were laid on them or any other senior bank official. As for the Bank of England, I'll refer you to this article from the BBC that had this to say. An investigation into the rigging of LIBOR, the benchmark interest rate that tracks the cost of borrowing cash, has been unexpectedly closed. The decision comes despite evidence that implicates the Bank of England. It means no one will now be prosecuted in the UK for so-called lowballing, where banks understate interest rates they pay to borrow cash. The Serious Fraud Office said its decision followed a detailed review of the evidence. In a statement, the SFO said, "Following a thorough investigation and a detailed review of the available evidence, there will be no further charges brought in this case. This decision was taken in line with the test of the Code for the Crown Prosecutors. The Code states that the evidence must support a realistic prospect of conviction and must be in the public interest." So since that sounded like a bunch of lawyer talk, I decided to dig a little deeper into that code. I found this definition for the Code of Crown Prosecutors with regard to public interest. Is it in the public interest for the CPS to bring the case to court? A prosecution will usually take place unless the prosecutor is sure that the public interest factors tending against prosecution outweigh those tending in favor. So if you're a Crown prosecutor and you're looking at evidence that implicates the Central Bank of England. What would be the fallout of a prosecution? What would that do to the faith in the economic system? What impact would that have on the public interest? Seems to me like that was a very clear-cut and legal way, I might add, to bury evidence, with no further action being taken. Now, obviously, this is all conjecture, and I'm just reading into the tea leaves. But you let me know what you think in the comments down below. Okay, so where does Ethereum fit into all of this? Well, on August 16th, 2019, a new interest rate benchmark was launched called LIBOR on the American Financial Exchange. What's different about this benchmark is that it's transaction-based, meaning it's based on the actual transactions that are occurring between banks. And those transactions are tracked using an Ethereum smart contract on a private sidechain. So there's no reason to rely on a human being to manually input those numbers. Now, I'm not going to dig into the technical explanation of these smart contracts and how they work, or even the fact that these private sidechains do not use decentralized consensus. They are using what's called a proof of authority consensus. Put simply, the nodes that verify transactions on their sidechain require permission, unlike the Ethereum main network, where nodes that verify transactions are permissionless. Their nodes will require permission to verify transactions. You have to remember that these are banks using this, and they're not about to go full bore into decentralized public blockchains. When asked about private sidechains, Andreas Antonopoulos had this to say at a talk back in 2016.
What's my thoughts on a private chain? So to me, private chains misunderstand the fundamental value proposition of an open, decentralized, borderless, permissionless blockchain. And this is akin to the Horse Buggy Manufacturing Association of America saying, we like this new automobile you've built, but we have a very large investment in horses and hay. So what we'd like to do is adapt it slightly by taking out the internal combustion engine, which is dirty anyway, consumes far too much energy, and replace it with a horse. But we really like the fundamental technology behind automobile, pneumatic tires. And we believe that pneumatic tires will surely transform the future of transportation. Just don't waste any time on this internal combustion thing. More seriously, there will be applications where building an intranet of money, building an internal system, will offer some use, primarily because what it replaces is even more centralized and broken from a controls and governance perspective than what a private chain would do. But if that's this interesting, the open, borderless, global, permissionless blockchain is this interesting, and I'm much more keen to work on that, because for that, the applications are truly astonishing.
You have to remember that we're in those early stages when institutions are both afraid and excited about this new technology. Even the so-called pioneers who are implementing this technology for banks know that they need to move slow. The message to take away from this is that despite the rhetoric, institutions are beginning to adopt this technology because they cannot deny its power. There's just no way they're going to do that in a public way. That's why the words Ethereum or blockchain are never used when the Fed references a LIBOR in their correspondence. This is what was actually written in the letter from Jerome Powell. Chairman Powell further stated in his letter, a LIBOR is a reference rate created by the American Financial Exchange based on a cohesive and well-defined market that meets the International Organization of Securities Commission's principles for financial benchmarks, while a LIBOR is a fully appropriate rate for banks that fund themselves through the American Financial Exchange or other similar institutions for whom a LIBOR may reflect their cost of funding. It may not be a natural fit for many market participants. Okay, so maybe that wasn't exactly a glowing recommendation, and maybe my thumbnail was a little clickbaity, But would you have clicked on this video if I said something like Ethereum takes on LIBOR? Because that's what I was originally going to call this video. I have always said that adoption of blockchain technology will truly take place when people's lives are influenced by the blockchain without them even knowing that they're interacting with it. Well, the clients of these banks that are using the Ameribor rate are directly impacted and benefiting from this technology, and they're not even aware it's happening. This will continue to happen over and over again while the mainstream is completely oblivious to this. And then one day, they'll suddenly start acting like this technology is everywhere, just like the internet in the 90s. It's an exciting time, and the LIBOR scandal only further illustrates the importance that people have the power to opt out of these corrupt financial institutions that play with our monetary system for their own benefit. I hope you found this as eye-opening as I did, and make sure you smash that like button and be sure to subscribe for future videos. Now, let's get back to empire building. Bye.